It is the week of Thanksgiving, and we are gathering with family we may not have seen in a while, which means there could be potential for conflict. To tackle all of this, I'm joined by Peter Coleman, a psychology professor at Columbia University. Peter, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
I want to start off by asking you, what are some of the topics that can be the kind of fire to start tension at the dinner table?
Well, it's a good question. I think these days, more and more topics trigger us, make us feel outraged. And so it's anything from the midterms, Donald Trump, even to what's happening in the Ukraine, what's happening in terms of climate change and, the COP meeting that just happened. So more and more issues are triggering political differences or value differences between people. So that's the bad news is that there's no fixed set of issues that you want to avoid. Many things can trigger us.
What tips do you have for navigating some of these hard conversations?
Well, I think the first thing I always ask people to do is, if you're, for example, going home for Thanksgiving and you're going to sit down at a table, you may want to ask yourself beforehand, ideally, what do I want to have happen here? Because I think these days, as I was saying, we get triggered easily. So we wander into conversations that escalate and go places that we don't want them to go. We really had no intention of, but we find ourselves there. So the first thing I just encourage people to do is think about, well, what do I want to have happen today? Do I want to engage the other and listen to them and hear them and connect with them? Am I interested in getting into things and escalating things and creating more tension? If you are, that's fine, and that is likely to happen more and more these days. But if you want to have a different kind of dinner conversation, time with your family, for example, then you want to go in with some intention about how you want to approach conversations, if you want to approach certain topics, or if they come up, what your plan is.
Now, if you're the host of Thanksgiving or the host in general, how do you navigate these different complicated situations and how can you kind of diffuse the situation when you're in charge of creating this experience?
If I'm hosting, I want to ask myself, has this happened before? When I bring my family together, my friend group together, are there provocateurs that tend to like to throw things out and stir things up? And if that's the case, if we have a history of being triggered like that, then you want to head that off. You want to have either a conversation with somebody beforehand and say, last year you went into this and it was really a problem for everybody and it made things very tense. Is there a chance that this year we can avoid that topic or we can, agree not to do that? So if there's a chance of it, you want to think about what to do. It's also possible just to start the dinner by saying, I love you all, and I'm so glad you're here, and I'm glad we're connected with each other. And in the past, we've gotten into some, rough conversations. If possible, let's agree to, respect each other today. And setting up certain ground rules doesn't have to be formal. It can just be appealing to people's better self. And if you can do that up front, you can set a climate so that if you do wander into things, you can say, okay, so we agreed to kind of keep things, a little bit more peaceful. Can we go back to that? You can use that as leverage to bring the conversation back in line.
I'm so glad you mentioned that because we often think of these dinners with a lot of anxiety and stress and negativity. Is there a way for people who are attending, in addition to the host, to kind of look at this positively or look at some of these difficult conversations that sometimes come up more positively?
Yeah, well, what's really important is that people have time to kind of connect and reconnect and synchronize a little bit and also hear from one another's life experiences before you get into political issues. So, you might want to just start by saying, how is everybody today? How are you feeling? It's been a tumultuous couple of years. People are exhausted. More and more people are feeling anxious. How are we doing? How's everybody doing? And sort of start with a more of a human connection around the table. And then if issues of, differences over political issues or moral issues come up, people are more inclined to at least remember that they have a relationship with one another and it's not all about politics or an issue. So basically setting the table emotionally to have people connect with each other as humans or as family members or friends before you wander into anything that's divisive.
Now, I want to take us to some of our viewer questions. We asked them to weigh in and get their questions so that you could advise more dinner tables than our own here at the News Hour. One of the funny things is that the questions and the sort of point of contention that came up most was politics, and that beat out COVID-19 by a mile. So I wanted to start out by asking a question that we received from quite a few people, but specifically Adam from Chicago and Vicky from Ohio would like to know if it's healthier to steer conversations away from religion and politics, or if there's a societal obligation to engage in those discussions. And do you have tips for both?
The first question you want to ask yourself beforehand is this happened in the past? Have we gotten derailed in the past? Do things get really tense really quickly? If that's the case, then you want to think about what to do. Setting some kind of, informal ground rules for how you're going to have a conversation is one way to do it. But again, some families can talk about politics, or some groups can talk about politics respectfully, differ without them getting derailed. If it's a conversation that you have had in the past and navigated well enough, then I think you can trust your group to be able to navigate that. But also know, as the host, it may be on you, if things get tense or awkward, to try to bring the temperature back down and to ask people to, again, show up as their best selves.
Another question we had from several people, including Caitlin from Sacramento, California. How do you bring up difficult subjects like a recent divorce or layoffs and stick to your values when there's so much pressure not to ruin dinner?
The issue is, when do you do that, right? So if someone's lost their job recently, what I might do is, if they're coming to my home for dinner, I would reach out to them beforehand or as they come in and pull them aside privately and say, how are you doing? How's it going? If it's really upsetting to them, if it's really destabilizing to them, then it may not be something to raise in public, right? To raise with the group. You may want to just deal with the more sensitive issues privately, so that you are talking about them and recognizing the importance of them, but not doing it in a place that may be embarrassing or a shame, right? So I think thinking about how to do that and if to do it, right? If it's a devastating thing, you might want to start with that, because those things are very human experiences for all of us and can move the conversation into a more connected place. But if it's somehow shameful or awkward for certain individuals, you want to be careful about when you have those conversations. You may want to have them, just not with the group.
From several submissions, including Amy from Texas, how can you deal with grief during the holidays?
Well, that's a great question. If this is a recent event where you've all lost someone, or someone at the table has lost a loved one, you need to be mindful again of where they are. Grief is a process, right? And it takes time. And for some of us, it takes a long time. If we've lost people in a surprising way, lost young people unexpectedly, you really want to respect that takes time. My inclination would be, if someone is coming to my home, I know they've lost someone, I would pull them aside and say, how are you doing with this? Is this something that you would be okay with us talking about, or at least mentioning, the loss? Or should we avoid that? You want to be really respectful of how people will be in very different places. Even in the same family, you may have, a couple who are dealing with the grief in very different ways. So the more you can be aware of that, the more you can not make matters worse for them.
Julia from Ohio wants to know, how do you deal with the hurt of a situation where as soon as dinner is over, the men go back to watching football and leave the women to clean up?
Well, my inclination, so I was, raised by a household of very strong women, and they were not okay with that. That was not the norm. It was not accepted. It was something that was immediately called out if it happened. And families are going to have very different norms around this and expectations around this. If it's something that, women resent at the table, I would start it even, in an amusing way, saying, we've decided tonight to flip roles, right? And so the men get to do this and the women are going to chill after after dinner, you know. So you could, in a playful way, call it out and say, this is not okay with us. Let's do this together. Let's have this meal together. But again, you know, different families are comfortable. Some families really prefer a certain routine that's been around for a long time. Others are not so comfortable, in which case it can be useful to call it out, you know, respectfully.
That sounds like it might be the start of a difficult conversation over dinner.
It definitely could trigger interesting conversations, but difficult conversations can be a useful thing. They're not necessarily a bad thing. It's about how we have those conversations. Do we have them in ways where we really listen to each other, or are we just trying to win a debate and, you know, compete with the other and weaponize their assumptions? And, you know, if we're doing that, things are going to get more tense and more escalated. If we're listening to each other respectfully and even agreeing to disagree, those conversations can be, you know, stimulating and interesting and memorable.
A viewer from Washington says that as a rule, I try not to engage, but sometimes men directly provoke, pushing buttons on politics or lifestyle. What self control tips do you have to stay dignified and repel ambush?
Oh, that's great. A great question. Well, breathing, right? Breathing always helps. So if you do feel triggered and you feel surprised, I mean, it sounds like this individual is expecting this to happen. So it is something that they, you know, can prepare for in some ways, and they can head off. If there is a particular person or two that tends to do this and they don't want this to happen at their table, have a conversation with them beforehand. In fact, what I recommend from research is that if you have someone who is provocative at your table and you know they're coming, I'd reach out to them a day or two before and say, would you do me a favor and go for a walk with me outside? Let's you and I take a walk and walk outside side by side together. That is a process of connecting to people that helps you feel more compassion and connection to one another and helps you hear each other differently and have a conversation saying, you know, I love you. You're a provocative character. You bring great energy to the table, but sometimes it's you know, triggering for many of us. So any chance that we can agree to do this differently this year, right? And have that kind of preparatory conversation before you get in.
Many viewers, including Jen and Marilyn, would like to know why don't they just spend the time with people who don't judge them or cause strife?
Well, that's tricky, I think. You know, I mean, many of us have inclinations to judge. Sometimes we judge people within our own group and our own family. Sometimes we're judging out groups. You know, humans are kind of hardwired to do that. And if you're starting to choose to be with people who don't judge you, your circle of friends and contacts is going to get smaller and smaller, right? We all have a tendency to do that. Again, it's not necessarily bad to judge one another. It's how we communicate about it. It's what we do with that information, right? So I think it's limiting in terms of our relationships if we just close ranks and not have contact with other people. I think what's more important is that we learn how to have conversations about those differences, their differences from yours and yours from them, in ways that are, you know, opening and constructive.
And finally, uh, a viewer who has a teen who identifies as non binary would like to know how a parent can hold space for their teen and also advocate for them as guests, and the host family may not understand. The father, in particular, in this situation, has shared a general irritation and impatience with liberal ideology and transgender nonconformity.
If I'm bringing my family in and I know this is going to be tense and confrontational, or they'll say the host will say something that's triggering, I would head it off. I would have a conversation with him beforehand and say, look, you know, we may have differences around this. We love you. We're happy to be here. But please respect our needs as a family, to, you know, respect one another. And I ask you not to go a certain place. You can, again, try to prepare before that. If it happens, my inclination is to express complete support for your child and your child's decisions and your position. If you want to head off things getting out of control, do it before there's a group watching you. And when you could have a chance of talking to someone and having this difficult conversation, again, taking a walk is a way to have those conversations that tends to be less confrontational. When we sit down at a table across from one another and talk about tense issues, we see the other as the problem. When we're walking side by side outside together in rhythm, there's something about that that connects us in ways that can help us bridge these differences in a different way.
Peter Coleman, psychology professor at Columbia University, thank you so much for your time and insight and wisdom.
Nicole, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And happy Thanksgiving to all.
Happy Thanksgiving. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Nicole Ellis.